So I thought I would begin by giving you a sense of our well-informed audience.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to hand out a map of the world, an unmarked map of the world,
Is this a test?
to any single person in this audience, they would be able to find Ukraine with no problem. But it raises a serious question, and let's just say hypothetically a very senior member of the State Department were to say something like, "No one cares about Ukraine." How would you respond? You've spent 2 tours in Ukraine, including as ambassador, of course, but based on your experience there, why should Americans care about Ukraine? What are the geostrategic what's the geostrategic significance of Ukraine? Why does it matter to Americans?
Yeah. Well, that's a simple question, and I'll do my best to answer it. I think there are many different ways that one can answer that question. So back in the Cold War, during the Cold War, it was a bipolar war with Russia and the United States. Then the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden 15 new countries. It seemed that they were on their way to, some of them at least, to becoming democracies, market economies. And then we had the early 2000s with 9/11 and some of the other developments that we saw there. And we now seem to have a bit of a muddle. We don't know exactly what we're doing. It's an inflection point in our history where we don't have the Cold War and the institutions that were founded during that time, whether they are on the political security side or the economic side, to bring a sense of order to how the world does its business. Those institutions are struggling a bit right now with the new challenges. And we don't necessarily have the cohesion that we did after 9/11, when the whole world was on the side of the United States as we were struggling with terrorism, and the world really was behind us. So now, what do we do with all that? And I think what you see, perhaps understandably, is that every country is jostling for position and jostling for advantage. And not every country has the same philosophy as the United States traditionally has done, that this is not a zero-sum game, that if we do right by others, they will eventually do right by us as well, that foreign assistance programming is a good thing certainly for those who are receiving that foreign assistance, but it's also good for the United States because it not only engenders goodwill for us, but it increases the prosperity in a country, it increases the security in a country, and those countries become better allies or partners for the United States. Russia, as a country that is a traditionally expansionist country, I mean, you just need to look, speaking of maps, at the Russian Empire. Obviously, there was the Soviet Union inherited that empire, tried to expand it further, if you consider the Warsaw Pact as part of an expansion of influence, if not actually territory, and then experienced a very sharp and perhaps unexpected contraction in the late 1980s and in 1991. And as Russia is trying to reposition itself in the world, it's taking advantage of some of the confusion that we see in the international space. So very early on, in the early 1990s, we saw Russia sort of have a lot of influence, shall we say, and a significant military presence in Moldova, specifically Transnistria. Then, fast forward to 2008, and we had the Georgia invasion. And then, again, a pause, and in 2014, you have the takeover of Crimea, when the world was really, sort of back on its heels and not really understanding what was happening. And then sort of the creeping war in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass. Russia is an expansionist power, and I think philosophically over the centuries has felt that it was important to expand its territory in order to keep the core safe. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And so when we see Ukraine being attacked militarily, both in Crimea and in the east. And just to remind everybody here that, although I know that you can pass the map test, but just to remind that Ukraine borders a number of NATO countries, and the US has treaty obligations to those NATO countries. So you have Ukraine being attacked on the east, and on the west it's bordering NATO countries. That's not a comfortable situation for us. And what we see in the war in Ukraine is the same military tactics, the same experimental use of weapons that we then see in a place like Syria, for example. And so it's clearly an experiment, I think that there is a particular strategic goal that Russia has, which is at a minimum to sow confusion and doubt and to retain as much influence over Ukraine as possible, but also to use Ukraine as a bit of a testing ground. And so at the embassy, we used to say, Ukraine may be the testing ground for Russia, but it needs to be the proving ground for the United States and the West in terms of how we respond to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So there's the military challenge. There is the Russians are using energy as a tool to make not only Ukraine, or try to make Ukraine, which has made significant efforts and achievements in becoming independent of Russia on the energy front, but a number of European countries are perhaps not as advanced as Ukraine in that respect, and so using energy as a tool to then exert political influence. We see the election meddling, which happened first in Ukraine in 2014, was then followed up pretty clear with meddling on the Brexit issue in the UK, and then obviously in our own elections in 2016. We hope that they won't be meddling in our elections this year. And also there's France, which is often not discussed, but was a very clear attempt to influence those elections. There's also the issue of attacks on the energy grid in Ukraine. The first, we have talked about this for a couple of decades in the United States, that, our energy grid is so vulnerable to attack, whether it's bad actors or a sovereign state. And in fact, Russia did that in Ukraine, and I believe it was 2015, December of 2015. So again, you can see what Russia is doing by trying out these different things and then possibly trying them out in other places. The last thing I would just say is the disinformation that is out there and that is very dangerous because it disorients all of us when we hear these issues that are out there, and then we don't really know what to think. And that's kind of the point, because if people sort of throw up their hands and go, well, I can't make sense of what that person is saying or what that person is saying, I'm just not going to think about it. I think that is, in some ways, the most dangerous thing in a democracy, because a democracy needs every citizen to be participating, to be informed, and to be making those decisions that are important for a country. So that is a really long way of saying that the reason we need to care about Ukraine is, there's a geostrategic reason, but there's also the fact that whatever we see in Ukraine, we also see it either in whole or in part in other parts of the world, including the United States, and we can't allow that to happen.